This lecture is entitled Primary Research, a Simple How-To Guide, and in it I'm going to walk you through everything you need to know about doing primary research. So primary research, and you may sometimes hear it referred to as ethnographic interviews, is really conducting phone, virtual, or in-person interviews with actors. These can include your users, and that's especially the focus of design thinking methodology, but it can also be your beneficiaries, the people that you're hoping to help, as well as experts, and this can be incredibly useful for learning more about the problem. Primary research is usually done one-on-one with a focus on rich and deep conversations. It's not really focus groups or panels, although those can also be effective ways to get feedback or get input into your ideas. You can leverage primary research throughout your capstone development process. It's a tool that I've used personally and professionally. On some of my innovative projects, I've talked with anywhere from 50 to 150 experts or users. So I strongly recommend that you consider doing more research than this course requires you to do, and that you leverage it at different points in the life cycle. For that reason, I'm going to talk about how early stage primary research differs from late stage primary research. So let's talk about early stage primary research. So these are the research interviews that you're doing early on in your process. And the goal at this stage is really to learn everything you can about the problem and grand challenge area. You specifically want to get very curious about why the problem hasn't been solved yet. So the goal of your expert interviews at this stage should be to understand the grand challenge, problem landscape, and innovation landscape. You should really dig into their point of view and their knowledge about this, as well as even maybe some of their biases or assumptions. You also want to explore the most impactful problem to address. At what point in the problem life cycle can you make the biggest difference? You also want to discuss why the problem hasn't been solved yet. And as part of this, and as part of our innovation model in this program, you want to really keep a lookout for those norms, deviance, or even diffusion methods. So this may be everything from what rules are holding the problem in place, what behaviors might counteract those rules, and then maybe what are clever or creative ways to reach out and diffuse your innovation and scale it. So one example of this might be that if you're looking at schools, for example, as a usual point of entry for your intervention, and as a point where you go, okay, I can reach lots of students this way, let me do that. You might want to look at other ways. Maybe it's after school time or before school time or through clubs or religious affiliations. There may be lots of different ways to get at the people you're trying to get at that might even work better or help you avoid certain challenges. So this should absolutely be an exploration point in your interviews. The goal of your user interviews is going to be slightly different, and it really should be to learn and understand everything you can about the user, the way they think and live. Most important, you really want to understand what their needs are and their pain points are. You want to make sure that you're talking about the problem in their terms. What are the problem or problems as they see them? And how can you solve their problems? You also want to understand what their motivations are, again, their biases or point of view. And you really want to investigate how you might get them to engage with your intervention. What are the incentives? What are the motivations? And above all, you want to make sure that you're creating empathy, that you're building in a nice rapport with the user that you're interviewing, and that you really begin to understand where they're coming from and what their needs are. You also, again, want to keep a lookout for any hints of norms and deviance that might help you design a really unique innovation. One tip is that you can use the ID lenses, actor, history, future, limits, parthood, and configuration, both at the beginning of your process to generate questions, and as you begin to look through your user interviews. It might be helpful to say, oh wow, look, they brought up a different actor that I hadn't heard before. Or look at that really interesting configuration. I hadn't thought about that as being relevant. So it'd be a great way for you to begin to pick apart what's really useful in the interviews that you've conducted. So later stage primary research, as I mentioned, is a little bit different. You can use these interviews really to get feedback on your ideas and begin to get specific targeted advice, especially from outside of your expertise. So this is the phase where you should be really saying, here's my idea, user, what do you think? What's going to work? Try it out. And it's also the point where maybe you approach potential partners or experts that are working on specific technologies that you want to better understand and begin to have those discussions about how to make your idea a reality. In these discussions, you really want to explore reasons why your project might fail. What are potential barriers to implementation? What are risks and mitigation opportunities for those risks? What are the points of differentiation in your project? What makes it special? What makes your project particularly impactful? And again, this connects with the innovation opportunities as well. So how can you really change the landscape, do something different that hasn't been done before to solve this problem? Or what innovation opportunities are already happening that you can leverage? You also want to look out for competitors or people doing similar things. You want to make sure that you're not doing overlapping in your work too much. But you may also want to identify people that you can partner with, or it might be a sign that you're actually on the right track. So you want to keep your view of competitors and people doing similar things somewhat balanced. You also want to look out for resources. This is a point where if you've established a great rapport with your users, with your experts, they may offer you resources and connections that can help you tremendously in advancing your work. They may also offer additional points of contact. And so you should absolutely ask if there's anyone else they think you should talk with. So let's talk about what the exact interviewing process is and some success strategies. So you want to prepare. To me, the greatest point of preparation is simply to develop a questionnaire. This can be anywhere from 5 to 50 questions that I have about my project. They may be questions that I specifically and intentionally want to ask or intend to ask, but they might also just be my questions. What questions do I have about the project? What am I trying to know? And what I often find is that actually my interviews end up departing quite a lot from that core questionnaire, but that in preparing for it, I've really framed my questions and gotten smart about what I want to ask and what I want to know. And that enables me to organically explore the topic with the person I'm interviewing. That's not to say that that's the way you have to do it. Some people like to develop specific questions and ask those specific questions in the interview, a little bit like conducting a survey. And that's okay. It can be a really useful technique, especially when you're trying to get a sense of baseline information. What does everybody think about this problem or about certain parts of the problem? You might find that a balanced approach works well. In any case, it's up to you how you want to shape your interviews, but I will say don't be afraid to depart from it. It's okay to have an organic conversation and see where it takes you. You also want to identify targets. And what surprises me is that I don't need to line up too many. Even if I just start with 5 or 10 people, they might also each recommend one person. And then all of a sudden I have an organic list of 20, 30, and it just goes on from there. Of course, you want to make sure you're having a balanced target list, that you're thinking of all the different kinds of people you want to talk to, whether it's experts, technologists, partners, users. So you don't want to talk to too many of the same category, but you do want to make sure you have a good sense of who to talk to, and they will sort of organically generate more interviews. So don't overthink it at the beginning. As I mentioned, these interviews can be very general. Let me just generally explore the problem, or it might be very much focused on a specific issue. So if I'm talking with several experts in homelessness about the problem of homelessness, I might have a very specific or targeted conversation with one about homelessness in a certain age group. Or I might have a very targeted conversation with an artificial intelligence technologist to understand how AI might be applied to that particular problem space. And it's okay to have a mix of both. You really want to allow 30 minutes. I actually find an hour is best to schedule your interviews. The reason is that you're going to spend time setting some rapport, introducing one another, explaining what you're trying to accomplish. And by that point, you've already run through 50, 20 minutes, and you usually have a lot of questions. I really try not to let my interviews run over an hour because that's a lot of time someone's offering. Occasionally they do, and that's okay. And the other exception is that sometimes there are some really core leaders, people who are quite busy, where maybe you can only get 15 minutes of your time. In that case, be super efficient and super prepared and respect their time boundaries. And this can be for people who are often VIPs, CEOs and that type of person. So you want to make sure that you schedule in advance. I often do this by scheduling a request email. You can call, but I find the email usually is just as effective and it helps you keep better track of who you're trying to reach out to. You want to cut to the chase in that email. Make sure in the header and that in the first 2 sentences you said, I want to interview you for my project. I actually even go so far as to bold the important part of my request so there's no way they can miss it. Especially when I'm reaching out to university experts, they tend to get a lot of university emails. So it's important that you try to jump out with what you're trying to get to and that you make your request very clear. You may also want to consider sending a 1-page overview of your project or your prototype for feedback. Don't assume that they looked at it if they've talked to you, but you can at least give them that opportunity to get a little bit further ahead and save more time for the interview itself. You should always ask, though, if they've read it and prepared, and be prepared to walk through your project at any point. One of my tricks of the trade is to always follow up on those emails at least once. It has shocked me at how often people don't respond to the first email, but they will respond to the second email. I don't know if it's subconscious or if it just shows you're serious, but it's a really much more efficient way to do your interview outreach. So don't just assume that if they haven't responded after one email that they won't respond. Of course, you do want to, at a certain point, move on. So if you've tried 2 or 3 emails and they haven't responded, certainly if they've told you they're not available now or ever, you want to respect that. Don't be afraid to leverage your network or credentials. If someone said you should get in touch with them and they're letting you use your name and say, hey, may I say you referred me? Absolutely use that. It's okay to say that you're a student working on a USC project. It's okay to say that you're working in the profession. You just want to make sure that you're not using it as a point of coercion, just as a point of mutual connection. And if you have any questions about that, please see your professor. Now, after you've done the prep, you're actually going to get to the interview itself. And it's good to have a small warm-up or introduction phase as part of that conversation. First, you want to introduce yourself. You want to explain your project. Now's a great time to use that elevator pitch if you've got one. You want to disclose the intent of the interview. What are you trying to accomplish? You also want to disclose if you intend to develop a business, if you are affiliated with any competitor, or have any conflicts of interest. You also want to clarify how the interview will be used. If you can, and if you'd like to, offer confidentiality, certainly between the interviewee and you may want to say that it's confidential but also includes your professor. So that way they know that while you don't intend to really share it outside of your work, that you may go to your professor with information about the interview. You should explain that you may not want to keep the interview confidential, that you would like permission to quote or cite the person, and may ask permission to circle back with them with a particular quote that you'd like to use. You also, at this point, may want to ask the interviewee to introduce themselves, even if you know a lot about them, and hopefully you should because you've prepared and you've looked them up on LinkedIn or on their web pages, or you found out whatever information you can that's available about them. You may at this point want to ask them just to run through an introduction. It's actually more of a signaling process. It signals to them that you respect them, that you want to learn about them, and it gives them a chance to tell you things that are important to them about their credentials or their background. It also can just open up new doors or areas of expertise. So it's a really helpful part of the conversation and worth the time. If you want to record the interview, even for your own personal use, it is absolutely essential that you ask them for their permission. Ask them if it's okay to record the call. This breaks in 2 ways. So on one hand, recording the conversation can be super useful. You can go back to it if you missed anything. But sometimes it does close people off and make them uncomfortable about sharing. So you may have a different kind of conversation than you would have if you weren't recording. It's really up to you to decide which is a more important priority. But again, you cannot record without letting someone know that you are recording. The last piece, and there's going to be a whole separate talk on this, a whole separate lecture, you want to make sure that you're generally following the ethical restraints and cautions of your profession. So make sure that you're adhering to your professional guidelines and codes of conduct. So the next part of the interview is the question and answer phase. I highly recommend that you ask questions and take notes. For some of you that process by writing via handwriting, go ahead and do it that way. I will say though that sometimes typing can be a bit more efficient because you can go back and use search features to look through your notes. As you're interviewing, make sure that you're trying to seek clarity. Ask where you don't understand. You want to explore what they have to say, follow up, ask beginners and open-ended questions, beginners mind questions and open-ended questions. And in that regard, my advice is ask the obvious. It doesn't always break in your favor, but I've found that when I ask seemingly obvious questions or question their assumptions, that sometimes we get to really interesting parts of the conversation, and they're some of the richest, most important sources of my ahas. So I really do ask the obvious questions, or sometimes what I even consider the dumb questions. You want to make sure that you aren't asking questions that can be answered through secondary research. So don't ask them, for example, how many homeless people there are in a particular state. You can ask them questions about secondary research only if it relates to specific research that they've conducted and what you're trying to, and things that you're trying to clear. Or if you're trying to create a base of comparison and really want to understand what is their view, make sure that you're really making the best use of their time. As much as possible, you want to be neutral, meaning you don't want to try to come at it from your point of view. You want to try to hear what they have to say and be as objective as possible. Later is when you can examine it more deeply and apply your point of view to the discussion. If you're having a conversation about your work or your idea, you want to explain and clarify, but try not to be defensive in your conversations and exchanges. You do want to expect naysayers or awkward moments. I've had some downright difficult or tricky interviews in my time. Sometimes I felt I'd have to pivot or even end a conversation early because we weren't really having a productive conversation. And all of this goes to saying, be prepared for and embrace the disruption of your project. That's why you're having these conversations, is to find those moments where maybe you hadn't fully thought something through or hadn't had that invaluable piece of information. So use these conversations to unearth just that. I'd also say, have a respectful tone and set a respectful tone. It's really important that you are acting almost as the host of the conversation. You've invited this person into your space. So while you can have a rich discussion or even debate potentially important points, or you may even feel a need to express something in the event someone does say something that you think isn't quite right, but do so in a professional, kind, and clear manner, and make sure that you remember that you're the host and that they're kind of on your turf in this sense. So you want to make sure that ultimately, regardless of how they come across, that you always maintain a respectful and professional engagement. So this leads to the last step, which is wrapping. This one really important and respectful tip is to end on time. This may sound obvious. Many interviews have run over accidentally or intentionally. And if someone's giving you a 30-minute or 60-minute chunk of your time, that time is incredibly valuable. So you want to make sure that you respect it. I always, regardless of whether or not I feel like the interview is complete, check in a few minutes before the end of the interview and say, we're about to hit the end of our time. Is it okay if we continue? Or is there anything else that you want to make sure that we cover? That way you're making sure that you signal that you're respecting the time and their contribution to your project. Along those lines, of course, you want to thank them. If it was a good interview, ask if you can stay in touch. If you think that there's someone that should be in your kitchen cabinet and be an advisor, you can ask them at this point if they would be willing to continue to advise you. Of course, you do want to respect if they say they don't have any further time or anything else that they can offer at this point. You also want to confirm any follow-up. If they said that they're going to send you any papers or projects, if you said you're going to share with them outcomes of your research, make sure that you check in on your action items following the call and that you do them. You always want to ask too if there are any other people that they recommend you speak with. Sometimes people may not want to have you talk to other people, but oftentimes they do recommend someone, and this can be a huge additional source of information. A lot of times too, this is also a way for you to gauge who's really respected in the field. Oftentimes people recommend that you talk to the same people because they're luminaries or because they have a lot to offer or share in this space. After the interview, you want to make sure you review your notes. Annotate or highlight your notes. Extract interesting insights or ideas. You may even want to organize around trends like through a grid. You want to also make sure that you capture and research unknown vocabulary, because vocabulary is really the language of any particular profession. And if you understand the words that they're using, you may better understand the ideas that they're communicating. So a couple pro tips. When you're interviewing experts, as I said, my major pro tip is learn the vocabulary, especially if it's a different field. You want to try to not lead the witness, so to speak. So again, try to really pursue an open-ended approach. Don't assume that they share your point of view about the problem or the solution. Really make sure they're sharing their perspective with you. You have lots of time to develop your own perspective later. You want to, again, maybe type your notes for early searching later, unless, of course, handwriting is an important way that you process ideas or think through things. You want to make sure that you organize quotes or findings according to trends. This can be a really useful way to see what are people saying, what are similar experts that they're recommending. In this way, we talked about this a little earlier, but you do want to consider asking some of the same questions in case you want to cite some of the data that you're saying. And again, you have to do this carefully. It's not formal research, but you can say, of the 10 experts I spoke with, all 5 felt that homelessness is a very serious problem, something like that. You also want to consider using this as a technique for capstone development outside the class. As I mentioned, you can even attach your primary research findings as an appendix. If you're having a conversation with an interviewee and you really respect them, you think they're an incredible expert or have done great work, don't be afraid to share that with them in a respectful manner. People don't always hear every day that they've made a meaningful contribution. And if you let them know that you value their input or expertise, that can help really break the ice on any phone call and establish a warm rapport. You don't want to overly defer to any expert's expertise. They may be an expert, but the problem hasn't been solved already, and you may be the person to do just that. You've done a lot of work and research as well. So don't be afraid to engage in a collegial manner or, again, question ideas or their perspectives. Don't not ask the question because you're afraid they're an expert and might think poorly of you. Again, as we mentioned earlier, respectfully debate or engage, but don't attack, regardless of what they say or how they engage with you. Lastly, exit gracefully. Feel free to wrap up the call, thank them for their time, even if you felt like it wasn't the most productive interview. Now for users, sometimes the rules of engagement are a little bit different and sometimes they're similar, so some of the same rules do apply. So when you're interviewing users, the most important thing that you can do is start from a place of empathy. Really try to respect and understand where they're coming from. Definitely disclose, explain your goals and projects. Definitely ask open-ended questions and try again not to lead the witness. Let them take the conversation to some degree where they want to go. Of course, ask questions, explore what they have to say, but try not to apply your point of view to their perspective. You definitely don't want to coerce their participation and you don't want to pry, so respect any boundaries that they set in the call. Proceed slowly and carefully. Make sure you give them time to warm up and maybe allot a little extra time if you can so that you give them enough time to comfortably talk about what you want to talk about with them. You also want to make sure that you don't promise or commit to anything that you can't follow through on. And again, you want to exit the call gracefully again and thank them for their time as well. So I hope this helps you understand a little bit more about how to do primary research. Again, I think it's a super powerful tool. It can be a little scary at times to have those cold calls, but I have to be honest, I've developed really powerful and positive professional relationships as a result of my research work. So I hope that you'll find it as valuable as I do.